The billionaire slammed his hand on the polished table. Does anyone here speak Japanese? Silence. Nervous glances darted across the room, but no one answered. Then, at the edge of the boardroom, a small figure stirred. Clara, a 10-year-old girl with blonde hair. The maid's daughter, overlooked and underestimated by everyone. Her uniform was simple, her presence quiet, almost invisible. Nobody expected her to speak. And yet when she finally did, the entire room froze. Even the billionaire's fury faltered, replaced by disbelief. Just a quick little pause before I forget. If you like this kind of stories of overcoming adversity and justice, please leave a like and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. I guarantee you won't want to miss it. Now, let's jump back in. The marble floor of the Ashford International Hotel lobby was so highly polished, it seemed to drink in the morning light and give it back in soft reflections. Tall glass doors rotated with a slow hiss as guests came and went. A steady tide of tailored coats wheeled suitcases and shoes that tapped brisk, confident rhythms. Amid the bustle, in a far corner between a potted ficus and the base of the grand staircase, a small figure worked quietly on her knees. A white cloth moved in slow, deliberate circles over the brass rim of a luggage trolley's wheel. The girl's sleeves were neatly rolled, not because she was in a hurry, but because that was how her mother taught her. Work is done properly or not at all. Her name was Clara Baines, 10 years old. Her hair, pale gold and fine as corn silk, was tied back with a plain ribbon, but loose wisps kept slipping free. The hotel's air conditioning made them flutter whenever someone passed too quickly. She wore a pressed white blouse and a plain gray skirt that brushed just below her knees, along with black leather shoes that had been polished almost as much as the brass she was cleaning. The uniform wasn't truly hers. It was an old one of her mother's, altered down with careful seams. Her mother, Mrs. Baines, had been the hotel's head maid for 8 years. On weekends, when Clara helped, she was just another pair of hands, small, quiet, invisible. Around her, the world carried on. A pair of businessmen wheeled their luggage past without slowing, one of them laughing too loud at something on his phone. A bellhop rushed by, narrowly avoiding her cleaning bucket without a glance. Near the reception desk, her mother spoke to a guest in patient, halting French, her voice like a thin ribbon of calm amid the lobby's noise. The scent of leave-in polish clung to Clara's skin, sharp and clean, masking the faint musk of the brass she'd been tending since morning. She didn't hurry. Her pace had its own rhythm, unbothered by the movements around her. Every wheel on this trolley would shine, not just the parts people could see. A sharp voice cut across the lobby. Does anyone here speak Japanese? A woman in a wide cream hat stood at the concierge desk, her gloved hands tightening on the handle of a matching suitcase. Staff behind the desk exchanged uneasy looks. One clerk coughed. No one stepped forward. Clara didn't move. It wasn't her place to speak. Not here, not now. She wrung out her cloth, water dripping softly into the bucket, and went back to polishing. No one noticed her. No one ever did, but they would. The lobby's morning rush had a certain music to it, and Clara knew the score by heart. At 9, the conference guests drifted out in small groups, their name badges swinging on lanyards as they headed for taxis. By 10, the tour buses arrived. Tired couples in matching windbreakers, their voices a blend of German, Spanish, and something else Clara didn't recognize. By 11, the flow shifted again, the quiet lull between checkouts and check-ins. Her mother always said this was the best time to get work done. Clara finished the trolley and wheeled it to its place beside the bellhop stand. "Thank you, love," murmured Toby, the youngest bellhop, without looking up from arranging luggage tags. His tone was polite, automatic, the way you might thank someone for handing you a napkin. She nodded once and moved on to the brass railing along the main staircase. It curled upward in a perfect sweep, catching the light in warm flashes where it was cleanest. She started at the bottom, working her way up step by step. From here, she could watch the lobby without seeming to. She saw the way guests leaned slightly toward the concierge, or the quick check of a watch before a businessman strode to the elevator. People's movements told their own stories if you knew how to read them. A man in a dark suit passed her on the stairs. "Careful with that. Don't scratch it," he said without slowing. His words weren't sharp, but they carried that practiced tone of people who assume correction is needed. Clara just dipped her rag again, the lemon scent rising strong, and continued her measured circles. At the top of the stairs, she paused to look down over the lobby. Her mother stood near the reception desk, smiling faintly at a young couple while their papers printed. The cream-hated woman from earlier was nowhere to be seen. Clara, her mother, called softly, "Come help in the east corridor." The east corridor was quieter, the air cooler. Light spilled through the tall, arched windows onto patterned carpet. The golden cream walls, holding the faint smell of lies from the arrangements on the side tables. Clara dusted each table in turn, her steps silent. She liked this part of the day, the steady rhythm of cloth against wood, the unhurried pace. People passed, sometimes nodding politely, often not noticing her at all. She had learned early that this kind of invisibility wasn't an accident. It was the way the world arranged itself. Still, she listened. She always listened. You learn things that way. The quiet of the east corridor broke with the sound of hurried steps, the kind that didn't belong to hotel staff. Clara looked up from dusting the side table and saw a middle-aged man in a travel-crumpled blazer. His brow was furrowed, his pace quick but uncertain. He stopped at the nearest staff member, a housekeeping attendant pushing a cart. Japanese?" he asked, tapping at his phone, then shaking his head. "Do you speak?" He trailed off, frustration bleeding into his voice. The attendant glanced at Clara as if to pass the problem on, then quickly turned her eyes away and gestured vaguely toward reception. "Sorry, sir. Maybe the front desk." But the man didn't move toward reception. He muttered something in Japanese, short, urgent, and rubbed the back of his neck. Claire didn't mean to stare, but his tone carried a certain weight. She recognized someone trying not to panic. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper with printed characters on it, pointing at a paragraph, then back to his phone. Clara's mother had taught her a long time ago. Sometimes helping me you were noticed, and sometimes it was better not to be. But this was different. There was no one else in sight who could bridge the gap between his need and the blank looks he was getting. She set her duster on the table and stepped forward small enough that the man didn't see her at first. "Excuse me," she said softly in Japanese. His head turned sharply, eyes widening as he took in the girl before him. Clara kept her voice steady, unhurried, repeating herself in a slightly clearer tone. Then she nodded toward the paper in his hand. "May I?" she asked, still in Japanese. The man handed it over without hesitation. His posture shifted, the rigid shoulders easing, his gaze sharpening in focus instead of frustration. She read the paragraph quickly, lips moving just enough to catch the rhythm of the words, then spoke to him in the same language, concise and direct. They exchanged 3 short sentences, no more. The tension in his face softened into relief. He bowed slightly, murmuring a quiet thank you in Japanese. Clara handed back the paper, gave the smallest of nods, and stepped away before anyone else could notice. But someone had from the far end of the corridor. A man in a charcoal vest had paused mid-step, a stack of menus in his hands. His head was tilted, his gaze fixed not on the traveler, but on the small girl, now quietly dusting the lees again, as if nothing had happened. The man in the charcoal vest didn't move for several seconds. He stood halfway in the corridor, menus balanced neatly in his hands, his gaze fixed on Clara. He was tall with dark hair swept neatly back, and his clothes had that effortless crispness that marked higher-ranking hotel staff. The small lapel pin, gold, shaped like a key, told her he was the maitre of the Ashford's rooftop restaurant. Clara knew him by sight. Mr. Cienvas, 37, known for his precision and his cool, unreadable manner. From where she stood, Clara could see that his stance had shifted, not in an obvious way, but enough to make her notice. His weight was forward on the balls of his feet, as though deciding whether to approach. He didn't. Instead, he simply watched her finish dusting the table, set the cloth neatly on her cart, and move on to the next. His gaze followed, but his expression didn't change. Only when a waiter appeared behind him with a question did he give a curt nod and continue down the corridor toward the service elevator. Clara didn't think much of it. People glanced at her sometimes, usually out of mild curiosity at why a child was working. It was easier not to meet their eyes. Back in the lobby, she returned to polishing the base of the reception desk. The brass there was duller, scuffed by countless shoes. Her mother passed behind her, carrying a small stack of linens, and murmured, "Nearly lunchtime. You can take your break after this." She nodded. At the far side of the room, Mr. Voss was speaking with the front desk staff. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, when they lifted, swept briefly over Clara again before moving on. The cream-headed woman from earlier reappeared, this time with a tall man in a slate blue suit. One of the hotel's upper managers, Mr. Her olden curse. He was all smooth gestures and polite smiles, but the way his jaw tightened when she spoke suggested the conversation wasn't going well. Clara caught fragments. Important client lost in translation, unacceptable delay. She kept working, but her ears stayed open. A bellhop passed by, muttering under his breath. She's really laying into them. Still, Clara said nothing. That was how you stayed invisible. You kept your eyes down, your hands busy, and your thoughts to yourself. But in the back of her mind, she could feel it. The slight change in the air, when someone had seen more than they were meant to. Clara was wiping down the low table near the lounge chairs when she noticed the shadow first. It stretched across the carpet before her, long and still. She glanced up and found Mr. Voss standing there, the menus from earlier now gone, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "You're Mrs. Bain's daughter," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet statement. "Yes, sir," Clara replied, straightening a little, but not stepping back from her work. He tilted his head slightly. "You speak Japanese." Her hands paused on the table just for a heartbeat before resuming their slow circles. "Some," she said simply. "Not many people in this building can," he noted, his tone unreadable. "Certainly not at the speed I just saw." Clara looked at the table's polished surface. "I just helped him find the right floor," she said. He was worried about being late. A small silence settled between them, the sounds of the lobby muffled for a moment. Mr. Voss studied her, his eyes not unkind, but assessing like a craftsman examining the grain of wood before cutting it. "Where did you learn?" he asked. Clara shrugged lightly. "At home. That's unusual for a 10-year-old. Another pause. She did not explain further, and he didn't press, though his eyes narrowed just slightly, as though filing away the unfinished answer for later. He glanced toward the reception desk, where Mr. Curse was still trying to pacify the creamed guest. "Sometimes," he said, almost as if to himself, "the right person isn't the one anyone expects." Then, more directly, "Would you come with me a moment?" Clara hesitated. She was supposed to finish the tables before lunch, and her mother preferred her to stay where she could be seen. But Mr. Voss didn't look like someone making a suggestion. He looked like someone who already knew she would follow. She nodded once. "Yes, sir." They moved toward the service elevator, weaving between guests and staff. His stride was long, but he slowed slightly so she could keep pace. Clara noticed how people reacted when he passed. Small shifts in posture, quick polite nods, the way conversations briefly paused. The elevator doors opened with a muted chime, revealing the quieter world behind the public floors. Stainless steel walls, the smell of coffee from somewhere nearby, and the hum of machinery. She stepped inside, the doors closing softly behind them. For the first time that day, Clara felt the rhythm of her workday break and something else begin. The service elevator moved with a low hum, the kind you felt more and more in your feet than your ears. Clara stood near the panel, hands clasped in front of her, while Mr. Voss pressed a button marked PH. She had never seen anyone go higher than 12 before. The ride was short. When the doors opened, the air felt instantly different, cooler, lighter, and carrying the faint scent of lavender and roasted coffee. Sunlight poured in from tall glass walls ahead, so bright Clara had to blink against it. They stepped out into the rooftop restaurant. It wasn't open yet, but every table was already set. Crisp white linen, polished silverware, folded napkins like origami. Glacier caught the light in delicate prisms, scattering it across the marble floor. From this height, the city stretched in all directions, rooftops, church spires, and the glint of the river cutting through it. The sky seemed closer here. "Mind your step," Mr. Voss said, though his voice was mild, not patronizing. Clara obeyed, careful not to brush against the chairs as they moved between tables. She could see her reflection faintly in the wine glasses, small, pale-haired, out of place. He led her to a long oak counter where two waiters were arranging dessert plates. They looked up briefly, curiosity flickering before they returned to their work. "This," Mr. Voss said quietly, "is where conversations happen that can change a career." Or in one he didn't elaborate. Behind the counter, a narrow door stood ajar. He pushed it open, revealing a small private lounge. Inside, the world shifted again. Deep armchairs and burgundy leather bookshelves with old hardbacks, a low table set with coffee service. The air was quieter here, insulated from the clinking and murmurs outside. On the far side of the room stood Mr. Alden Curse and the cream-hated woman. She was speaking in sharp, clipped phrases, her English thickened by a Japanese accent. Curse was smiling too much, his hands folded in front of him like a man trying to hide the fact he didn't understand a word. When they noticed Clara, both pairs of eyes landed on her, the woman's with mild surprise, Curse's with a flash of confusion. "She's the one I told you about, mister," Voss said simply. Curse glanced between them. "The maid's daughter?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. Clara felt the words, but kept her face still. She stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee wrapping around her like a soft fog. The private lounge seemed to hold its own gravity, pulling sound inward and slowing everything down. "Mister." Voss gestured for Clara to sit in one of the leather armchairs. She hesitated. Furniture like this was for guests, not for people like her, but his steady look told her it wasn't a suggestion. She perched on the edge of the seat, hands folded neatly in her lap. The cream-hated woman watched her closely, but without speaking. Clara returned the gaze only briefly, before letting her eyes drift to the coffee set. On the table, porcelain so fine it almost glowed, steam curling gently from the spout. "Clara," Mr. Voss began, "I want you to tell them how you learned to speak Japanese." Her voice was quiet but steady. "My mother's friend taught me." "That friend?" Curse asked, leaning forward slightly. "He or she was Japanese." Clara nodded once. "Yes, sir. His name was Haruto." The creamed woman's expression softened just a fraction at the name, though she gave no other sign. "Haruto worked with my father," Clara continued. She didn't look at them now, but past them, her gaze unfocused. "They used to talk in Japanese when they didn't want anyone else to understand. Sometimes they'd teach me words later." When her sentence stopped short as though she'd reached an edge she wasn't ready to cross. "Mister." Voss didn't push, "and you kept practicing." "Yes." "How?" Curse asked, his tone tilting toward skepticism. "I had books," Clara said, "and I listened to recordings. Hiro sent them. My mother let me play them in the evenings when she finished work. We'd write letters. He would correct my grammar. I would try again." The cream-hated woman's eyes lingered on Clara with a sharper focus now, as though she was weighing something. In the silence that followed, the ticking of a small brass clock on the shelf seemed unusually loud. Clara's hands stayed still in her lap. She had learned long ago that rushing to explain made people think you were trying to prove something. If they wanted to believe her, they would. Mr. Voss shifted his weight slightly. "She's here because we have a problem," he said to the others. "One we can't fix with phrase books and polite smiles." Curse looked unconvinced, but the cream-hated woman's mouth curved in the faintest of nods. "Let's see," she said in Japanese. Clara answered in kind without pause. Clara's fingers tightened briefly around her lap as the conversation continued. The cream-hated woman, now speaking in Japanese, asked a question that would have stumped most adults. Clara answered smoothly, almost without thought, but her mind flickered back to the small apartment she once called home. Haruto's letters had arrived every fortnight. They smelled faintly of ink and old paper, each one folded with meticulous care. She remembered the evenings she would sit on the floor with her mother, scraping together candles when the electricity failed, reading and rereading the letters until every stroke of a character felt like an extension of her own hand. Her mother, Elena, had been gentle but firm. "Learn quietly, Clara," she would say. "The world doesn't hand opportunity to those it overlooks." Clara had nodded, holding back tears because her father's absence had left both of them with an invisible weight, a mix of fear, pride, and unspoken grief. Now, sitting in the sunlit lounge, Clara felt that past edge sharpened slightly. She had learned discipline early, not the kind drilled in schools or sports, but the kind born from necessity. Making meals for her mother, keeping the apartment clean, listening more than speaking. It had all trained her to observe, anticipate, and act with precision. Mr. Voss's voice brought her back. "She persevered while managing every other task at home," he said softly, almost to himself. "It wasn't handed to her." Kerr frowned, unsure whether to challenge the statement or not. Clara didn't look at him. She was already thinking of the next question, the next phrase, mentally arranging words like pieces on a board. A flashback surfaced, brief but vivid. A small bookstore with sunlight spilling over Japanese dictionaries. Clara perched on a wooden stool, tracing characters with trembling fingers. Haruto's corrections were stern but kind, always leaving a margin of encouragement. "Precision matters, Clara," his note said. Even in silence, the present intruded again. Clara answered the creamed woman's next question without hesitation. Every word was clear, measured, confident. She had learned to carry weight in her voice without need of embellishment. A reflection of years spent under careful instruction, in silence, in waiting. "Your dedication is remarkable," the woman said softly, almost admiringly. Clara nodded once, a small, composed gesture. She didn't explain her sacrifices. There was no need. Her persistence spoke louder than any story could. Mr. Voss leaned back slightly, watching her with that quiet calculation he always carried. In that moment, Clara understood something. The next step wouldn't just test her skill. It would test whether the world could see her worth through the quiet strength she had cultivated in shadows. The lounge door opened onto a hallway that led to a small conference room. Clara followed Mr. Voss and the cream-hated woman silently, her steps careful, measured. The polished floors reflected the overhead lights, making the room appear longer than it was. Inside, a few executives stood clustered near a sleek, dark table. Papers were scattered, laptops open. At the head of the table, Alden Kurse leaned over a folder, clearly frustrated. "I've tried every interpreter," he muttered almost to himself, tapping the folder with a polished fingernail. "None of them can make sense of this client's notes." The cream-headed woman looked at Clara. "It's time," she said softly. Clara swallowed, steadying her breath. The problem wasn't the language itself. Japanese was familiar, almost second nature. It was the weight of expectation, the eyes of strangers judging her before she even spoke. She stepped forward, quietly confident. She knelt slightly over the folder, scanning the handwritten notes with a trained eye. Each stroke of ink, each irregular spacing, told her not just the words, but the subtle intentions behind them. The client had written in a hurried, almost panicked hand, mixing colloquialisms with business terminology. Most adults would have stumbled. Clara read it like a map, tracing the lines of meaning with ease. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small but precise, drawing the room's attention. Kurse turned sharply, his expression skeptical. Clara began speaking, first slowly, then with increasing fluency, translating the notes into English with exact nuance. The executives leaned in, some exchanging doubtful glances, others scribbling notes, realizing this translation was not just correct, but insightful. Kurse's brow furrowed. "She's accurate," he said quietly, disbelief creeping into his tone. He glanced at the cream-hated woman, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The tension in the room shifted. Whispers began, some curious, some incredulous. Clara remained still, focused entirely on the text in front of her. Unconcerned with the shifting perceptions, each sentence she delivered carried weight without ceremony, her calm presence amplifying the word's clarity. A sudden pause fell over the room as she finished the final page. Silence held for a moment, thick and deliberate. Then slowly one of the executives leaned back, a smile flickering. Another exhaled audibly. Even Kurse's lips twitched as though the realization of her skill was settling into him with reluctant respect. Mr. Voss, standing slightly to the side, gave a small nod, the kind that said without words, "This was always meant to happen." Clara, still composed, returned the folder to its place on the table. She didn't speak further, letting the moment linger. The room had changed. She had not changed. But from here, the perception of what a maid's daughter could do was beginning to tilt. The room remained still for a moment. After Clara returned the folder, the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder, the polished wood of the table reflecting the shifting faces of executives who hadn't yet fully absorbed what had happened. Alden Kurse finally spoke, his voice low but edged with reluctant respect. "I didn't think anyone could do this." His fingers drummed lightly on the folder, hesitant as if acknowledging her skill might destabilize the hierarchy he'd relied on. Others began to speak quieter now. "She's precise. Every nuance accounted for. This isn't just translation. It's interpretation at another level." The murmurs spread like a soft wave, subtle but unstoppable. Clara noticed the change in posture first, shoulders straightened, eyes lifted, people leaning forward rather than away. Mr. Voss watched from the side, arms crossed, but expression unreadable. He had been waiting for this, for her skill to speak louder than any introduction or recommendation could. And now it was doing exactly that. The cream-hated woman glanced at Clara, and for the first time since entering the room, there was a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "Remarkable," she said in Japanese softly, as if speaking directly to Clara's years of quiet preparation. Clara simply nodded, keeping her hands folded, letting the acknowledgement land without exaggeration. Pride, she had learned, was private, skill, public. A small executive, younger and nervously adjusting her glasses, leaned closer to a colleague. "Did she just?" Her voice trailed off. The colleague nodded, equally odd, both whispering, but careful not to break the newfound focus the room held. Even Kurz's skepticism began to erode visibly. He straightened, rubbed the back of his neck, and finally allowed a tight smile to slip through. The tension that had gripped him at the start, the irritation, the doubt had shifted into something else. Recognition, respect, a subtle but powerful acknowledgement that Clara's quiet presence carried authority. Outside the room, the receptionist and a few passing staff had noticed the cluster of executives peering out curiously. Whispers traveled beyond the doors, carried on a wind of curiosity and tentative admiration. Clara had become the center of attention without raising her voice, without demanding acknowledgement, simply by being precise, composed, and capable. She gathered her notes, ready to leave. Her calmness, even as the room buzzed quietly, was magnetic. It drew people's eyes, subtly demanded their respect. She didn't look for approval. She didn't need it. It was enough that the evidence of her skill had done the talking. Mr. Voss allowed a small smile. He had seen her potential before anyone else, and now the world, or at least this small corner of it, was beginning to see too. Clara moved toward the door with quiet dignity, leaving a room subtly transformed by her presence. By mid-afternoon, the quiet ripple of Clara's accomplishment had spread through the building like a subtle current. Staff who had previously passed her without a glance now found themselves exchanging furtive looks, a half smile, a raised eyebrow, small acknowledgments that carried weight far beyond casual courtesy. In the cafeteria, a group of junior assistants whispered as she entered to collect her usual tea. "Did you hear?" The girl who cleans the floors just one paused, lowering her voice as though saying it aloud could shatter disbelief. Translated the client's notes perfectly. Another shook her head. "I thought it was a mistake, but curse." Even he had to admit it. Clara moved past them silently, her tray held with careful hands, eyes forward. She noticed the subtle change in posture, the slight hesitation in conversation. They didn't know her story. They didn't need to. Her presence alone now carried a quiet weight, the kind that demanded attention without demanding it. Near the elevators, maintenance staff and security glanced in her direction, nodding almost imperceptibly. A young janitor, Miguel, who often swept the hallways beside her, caught her eye. He gave a small, almost shy thumbs up. Clara offered the barest lift of her chin in return, acknowledgement without ceremony. In the lounge where she had first proven herself the cream-hated woman and Mr. Voss watched from behind a half-closed door. "They're noticing," Voss said quietly. "Word spreads faster than any memo when the truth shows itself." The cream-hated woman smiled faintly, her tone soft but sharp, and some will resist noticing just to see if it holds. Clara, oblivious to being watched, had already moved back to her regular tasks, wiping counters and straightened chairs with her usual efficiency. Yet, the air around her had suddenly shifted. Conversations that had once ignored her were now punctuated with whispered speculation. Skepticism lingered in some eyes, curiosity in others, admiration in a few. Even the higher floors carried echoes of her feed. Executives who had dismissed the cleaning staff as peripheral began to speak of her in tentative tones. "She's remarkable. I didn't expect. Keep an eye on her." The whisper network was a silent acknowledgement, an invisible wave of recalibration. Clara could sense it, though she never sought it. She had learned long ago that influence didn't require boastful display, only consistent presence and undeniable skill. By the end of the day, the hum of quiet conversations had formed an undercurrent that even Kurz couldn't ignore. The building itself seemed to breathe differently, as if acknowledging that a girl who had long been invisible was now unmistakably someone to be seen. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, glanced briefly at Mr. Voss, and allowed herself the smallest controlled smile. The work continued, but the perception had shifted. The quiet wave of recognition was only beginning, and it would not be denied. The day had begun quietly with the usual hum of office life and the faint scent of polished wood and coffee. By late afternoon, the building had settled into a more reflective pace, the earlier ripple of whispers still lingering in corners and hallways. Clara was stacking chairs in the lounge when Mr. Voss approached, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. "CL," he said, his voice even measured, carrying no hint of fanfare. She straightened, placing the last chair in line, and met his gaze calmly. "I've been watching you," he continued. keeping his distance, careful not to crowd her. Not just today, not just with the notes. His tone suggested that he had been paying attention longer than she realized. Clara inclined her head slightly, a signal that she was listening, but she said nothing. "There's a position I'd like you to consider," he said. He paused, letting the words settle as if testing her reaction. "It's not a favor, and it's not symbolic. It's earned. You've demonstrated precision, composure, and insight that most of our trained staff couldn't match." Clara's fingers folded neatly in front of her, tightened slightly on the fabric of her apron. She had anticipated recognition, but offers carried hidden intentions. "What sort of position?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "A role assisting with high-priority translations, client liaison, and document analysis," Mr. Voss explained. "It's demanding, visible, and it places you in the same room with people who have dismissed your skill up until now. I need someone who can perform under pressure without showing off, without letting ego interfere. That person is you." Clara considered this quietly, weighing not just the opportunity, but the implications. Was she to become a token presence? Someone highlighted for a single success? Or was this a genuine acknowledgement of her capabilities? She had learned caution, patience, and the value of observing before acting. "And if I refuse?" she asked softly. Her eyes steady, meeting his boss allowed a faint smile respectful of her control. "Then you continue as you have, quietly excellent, making your mark in ways most will never notice. But the work you've done today shows that you are capable of more. That more will matter." Clara's lips pressed together for a moment. Then slowly she nodded. Not in excitement, not in submission, but in measured acceptance. She understood the challenge. Skill alone would not secure respect here. She would have to navigate perception, skepticism, and expectation with the same precision she brought to her work. "Very well," she said, her voice calm, almost solemn. "I will consider it." Voss inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than triumph. "That's all I ask. No promises, no spectacle, just the work done right." As he turned to leave, Clara remained still, absorbing the quiet gravity of the offer. It was a door opening, yes, but it was also a test, one that required not only skill but poise, patience, and self-possession. The ripple of whispers outside would soon intensify. But for now, in this small moment, Clara held control. Morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of the executive wing, catching the polished surfaces and the subtle gleam of brass handles. Clara stepped into the space with quiet composure, her small frame almost swallowed by the scale of the room. The air smelled faintly of leather, ink, and carefully brewed espresso. A world apart from the muted aroma of cleaning supplies and waxed floors she'd been accustomed to, she carried a simple notebook and a pen, her uniform replaced with a plain tailored dress in muted gray. It was professional, understated, a deliberate choice to blend without drawing attention. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate. She had long practiced invisibility, but here invisibility would not serve. Presence and precision would. Her new colleagues paused mid-con conversation as she walked past. A few glanced openly, their eyes narrowing slightly, assessing. Marcel, a senior analyst with sharp features and a crisp navy suit, raised an eyebrow. "So this is the girl," he muttered under his breath to the colleague beside him. The other nodded, unsure whether to be impressed, dismissive, or mildly irritated by the shift in hierarchy. Clara nodded politely but said nothing. Words were unnecessary for the first impression. Poise and attention to details spoke louder than conversation. She moved to her assigned workstation, a compact desk nestled between floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and set down her notebook. She took a moment to arrange the materials, pins lined up, folders stacked by size, tablet charged, a ritual that calmed her and projected quiet authority. The first task arrived almost immediately. A set of client documents requiring translation, verification, and cross-referencing. Colleagues watched from the periphery, some whispering, some openly skeptical. Marcel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly waiting for a misstep. Clara did not flinch. She read the documents, her handwriting precise, her understanding immediate, correcting inconsistencies with calm efficiency. By mid-morning, a low murmur had begun among the staff. "She's thorough," whispered Anna, a junior assistant, her tone a mix of disbelief and admiration, "faster than anyone I've seen." Clara noticed the subtle shift in dynamics. Where before she had been ignored, she was now observed. Where before her skill had been invisible, it was quietly acknowledged. Yet she remained self-contained, focusing on the work itself rather than the reactions. Recognition, she knew, was fragile. It could be fleeting if pursued too eagerly. By lunchtime, even Marcel's posture had softened slightly, not in approval necessarily, but in measured acknowledgement. Clara, small and composed, had begun to occupy space she had never held before, not through loud display, but through precision, calm, and undeniable skill. As she stepped away from her desk for a brief break, she glanced out the window at the courtyard below, where the familiar rhythms of her old life carried on. She felt neither longing nor regret, only quiet awareness. Today marked a threshold, one she would cross with care and purpose. The conference room was unusually still, the hum of the city outside a distant muffled vibration through the thick glass walls. Clara entered with her notebook tucked under one arm, a neutral expression, masking the flutter of anticipation she felt. Around the long mahogany table, executives and analysts were gathered, their suits sharp, their eyes sharper. Marcel sat near the head of the table, arms crossed, clearly skeptical. "This is a critical client file, Mr. Voss began, his tone deliberate. "Errors could cost us millions and damage our reputation. We need absolute accuracy, and it must be done in under 30 minutes. His gaze lingered on Clara, subtle but unmistakable. The weight of expectation pressed down, not in volume, but in quiet intensity. Clara nodded, kneeling briefly to ensure her pen was ready, her tablet positioned correctly. She had practiced this discipline countless times in small, unnoticed ways, double-checking details, noticing patterns, catching inconsistencies others overlooked. Now it was amplified. The documents were handed to her, each page filled with intricate tables, numerical data, and fragments of foreign language notes. Her eyes moved with measured focus, absorbing detail, cross-referencing mentally, translating phrases, and correcting errors as she went. The room was silent except for the faint scratch of her pen and the occasional clearing of a throat from a colleague. Minutes passed, stretching intense elongation. Marcel's brow furrowed. Even the most confident analysts shifted subtly, some whispering under their breath, glances flicking toward Clara. She noticed everything. The subtle fidgeting of hands, the slight tightening of jaw lines, the weight of unspoken doubt. She did not flinch. Each correction, each verified translation, each meticulous adjustment was precise, deliberate. At 28 minutes, she closed the last folder and placed her pen down. She lifted her gaze, meeting the eyes of every person in the room, steady and composed. Silence followed, thick and deliberate, before Mr. Voss exhaled softly. "Flawless," he said, voice low but carrying across the room. Marcel's posture straightened, a slow acknowledgement settling into his shoulders. Whispers began, a ripple of astonishment spreading through the staff. Even those previously dismissive now observed her with guarded respect. Clara neither smiled nor moved to draw attention. Her presence, quiet and unwavering, was enough. She had delivered not through showmanship, but through mastery and calm control. Later, as she stepped out of the room, her notebook pressed to her chest. Anika approached with wide eyes. I've never seen anyone do that," she murmured, a mixture of awe and disbelief in her voice. Clara nodded, a faint acknowledgement, letting her actions speak where words were insufficient. Outside, the hum of the city felt distant again. In this small, deliberate space of accomplishment, Clara had proven that skill, focus, and silent authority could demand recognition, not through loudness, but through exactitude and presence. The next morning, the office carried a subtle tension, a hum of whispered speculation threading between cubicles and glass-walled offices. Clara arrived quietly as usual, her notebook in hand, hair neatly braided, dress pressed and plain. Nothing announced her presence, yet a few heads subtly turned, colleagues aware now that she was no ordinary newcomer. Marcel approached first, not with words of congratulations but with a measured nod. "The client feedback arrived," he said, voice clipped but not unkind. "Perfect execution. They've requested your work be highlighted in the quarterly review." Clara paused, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her notebook. A symbol, she realized, was not the announcement itself but the acknowledgement that her meticulous, quiet efforts mattered. No applause, no spectacle, only the simple act of recognition in a formal, visible way. She followed Marcel to the central conference room. There, the quarterly report was displayed on the large screen. Among the pages of charts and graphs, the client's notes had been transcribed, and next to the section Clara had meticulously corrected, her name appeared, prepared by Clara Jensen. A hush fell over the observers. Some faces were curious, others slightly envious, and a few like Marcel's softened with measured respect. The room's usual chatter had been replaced by the quiet acknowledgement that someone overlooked, underestimated, and previously invisible had produced work impossible to ignore. Anna, hovering near the doorway, whispered, I never thought I'd see the day. Clara offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't need praise. The acknowledgement itself, public and formal, was enough. As colleagues murmured among themselves, Clara returned to her desk. Each step was deliberate, each movement measured. The symbolic recognition wasn't a gift, it was earned. Every correction, every translation, every precise calculation had led to this moment. And yet, she remained humble, composed, her focus already shifting to the next task. Later, as she looked out the glass walls at the bustling city below, she allowed herself a brief reflection. Recognition could be fleeting, and true skill would always demand discipline to maintain. Yet, today marked a threshold, a subtle but undeniable proof that presence, quiet mastery, and unwavering focus could carve space even in worlds previously closed off. A small smile tugged at her lips, the first in a long while. Clara returned to her work, her movements as precise and contained as ever, knowing that greatness did not need fanfare to matter. Sometimes it needed only the quiet acknowledgement that it existed, a name on a page, a nod, a room that now bore witness. The office had settled into its usual rhythm, the hum of keyboards and low murmurs of conversation, a constant backdrop. Clara moved through the space as she always did, composed, deliberate, and almost invisible. Yet the subtle awareness of her presence had shifted. Colleagues glanced up more often, their expressions carrying curiosity, cautious respect, or quiet admiration. It was Anna, the junior assistant, who first approached her during a lull in the morning. She held a small folded note in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. I wanted to say thank you, she murmured, for showing me that paying attention, really paying attention, matters. She handed Clara the note without meeting her eyes. Clara accepted it with her usual quiet composure, unfolding the paper. Inside were a few lines written with careful deliberation. You reminded me that small actions done with care can speak louder than words. I'll try to notice more. Anika, her lips curved into the faintest smile, a gentle acknowledgement of the ripple her quiet presence had created. Later, Mr. Voss stopped by her desk, an unusual move for someone of his position. Clara, he said softly, voice lowered so others could not overhear. Your work yesterday, the accuracy, the timing, it saved us from potential disaster. I don't always express it, but I want you to know it didn't go unnoticed. He offered a brief, firm handshake, a gesture more sincere than any formal announcement. Throughout the day, small gestures accumulated. A carefully brewed cup of coffee left at her desk, a quiet nod from Marcel in passing. A folder returned with an approving checkmark, subtle acknowledgments of skill, presence, and reliability. Each one, understated, carried weight far beyond words. By late afternoon, Clara found herself at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the city. The wind brushed her hair across her face, and she thought of the years she had spent unseen, the long hours performing duties that often went unnoticed. Now, in small, quiet ways, she felt the acknowledgement of her worth ripple outward, personal and intimate rather than grand or ostentatious. A brief memory flitted through her mind, her mother teaching her to perform every task with care even when no one was watching. Those lessons had built this quiet resilience, this ability to command attention without demanding it. The gestures from her colleagues were not simply gratitude. They were validation that her principles, her diligence, and her patience mattered. Clara returned to her work with the same precision as always, yet the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. The quiet gratitude she received today was not a performance. It was a reflection of truth, of skill recognized without fanfare, and of presence acknowledged without spectacle. In these small moments, she reclaimed dignity not for herself alone, but for all the overlooked hands that built the world. The boardroom felt colder than usual that morning. Clara sat at the far end of the table, hands folded neatly, listening as Mr. Hughes reviewed the success of the recent deal, the one she had made possible. Halfway through, a new voice cut in. Impressive, said Mr. Stanton, a silver-haired executive with a reputation for dismantling careers. But are we really giving credit for this to a child? His tone was casual, but the edge in it sliced clean through the air. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Hughes didn't speak. He watched Clara. Stanton leaned back. I don't mean to be harsh, but let's be realistic. She's the maid's daughter. No formal training, no credentials. For all we know, that translation was luck. The words landed like stones in still water. Clara met his gaze unblinking. It wasn't luck, she said softly. Oh, Stanton's smirk widened. Then prove it right here. Someone slid a document across the table, a complex Japanese contract, dense with technical terms. Clara read silently, her finger tracing each line. The room waited. After a moment, she spoke calm, precise, translating not only the words, but the nuance hidden between them. She pointed out a clause that would have cost the company millions, her voice never rising above a steady, respectful tone. When she finished, Stanton's smirk was gone. The silence that followed wasn't just surprise. It was recalibration. Hughes closed the folder. I think that's all the proof we need, he said. His voice was measured, but his eyes held a quiet satisfaction. Clara simply nodded, her hands folding again. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The work spoke louder than any defense she could give. For the first time, Stanton looked at her not as the maid's daughter, but as someone who belonged at that table. The challenge came sooner than anyone expected. Late that afternoon, an urgent call came from Tokyo. The company's overseas partners were threatening to walk away unless a critical misunderstanding was cleared up within the hour. The document had already passed through 3 translators. All had failed to satisfy the client. Mr. Hughes' voice was low but firm. Clara, you're with me. The conference room was tense. A video call flickered to life, revealing 4 stern executives speaking rapid Japanese. Clara stood just behind Hughes' chair, listening intently. Half a minute in, she caught it. A subtle shift in tone, an idiom mistranslated earlier that changed the meaning entirely. Without waiting to be prompted, she stepped forward. Excuse me, she said, bowing slightly toward the screen in flawless Japanese. She apologized for the confusion and rephrased the company's position with precision and respect. Her delivery was calm, almost gentle, but her choice of words carried weight. The atmosphere on the other end shifted, frowns softened. One of the executives even smiled faintly. They responded slowly at first, then with warmth, agreement, and finally commitment to proceed. When the call ended, the room was silent. That, Hugh said, turning to Stanton, is the difference between luck and mastery. Clara stepped back, her face composed inside. Her chested with the quiet relief of someone who had carried a secret skill for years, unsure if it would ever matter again. Stanton, to his credit, gave a short nod. Well, I stand corrected. There was no applause, no grand announcement, just the sound of chairs shifting, papers being gathered. But in the way people looked at her now, she could feel it. The shift from curiosity to respect. She didn't speak again that afternoon. She didn't need to. The proof had been delivered. The day was almost over when Hughes asked Clara to stay a moment. The others had left, their murmured conversations fading down the hallway. He leaned against the edge of the table, arms folded. You should say something to them tomorrow about today. They need to hear it from you. Clara shook her head. I'm not here to give speeches. Maybe not, Hughes said. But sometimes the quiet voice is the one they listen to. The next morning, during the daily briefing, Hughes nodded to her. Every eye in the room turned toward the small blonde girl standing beside the coffee service. She didn't move to the front, didn't raise her voice. She just spoke. I only want to say this, she began. People don't always look like what they know or where they've been. I'm here because my mother cleans this building. I help her sometimes. That's all most of you have seen. Her gaze swept the room, steady and unblinking. But skills, they don't vanish because your life changes. They wait until someone actually looks. Silence, not uncomfortable, just the stillness of people realizing something they should have known all along. She gave a small bow, then stepped back. No dramatic pause, no invitation for praise. Hugh spoke next, brisk as ever, moving on to agenda items. But the air was different now, lighter, less guarded. Later, as she passed through the lobby, 2 employees she barely knew nodded to her. The gesture small but genuine. It was enough. That evening, the building was almost empty again. The hum of the vending machine was the loudest sound in the lobby. Clara sat on a low bench waiting for her mother to finish her rounds. She had a small cloth pouch in her hands, the same one she'd kept in her backpack for years. Inside was a single photograph. Her mother, much younger, standing in front of a school in Kyoto. Clara's own hair was shorter back then, her hand clutching her mother's skirt. It was the last picture taken before they left Japan. She traced the worn edges of the photo with her thumb, the memory vivid but distant. Her mother appeared from the corridor, gloves still on, hair pulled back tight. She gave Clara the same tired smile she always did after a long day. "All done?" Clara asked. "All done," her mother replied, setting the cleaning cart's handle against the wall. They stepped out into the evening air. Across the street, the city lights reflected on wet pavement, turning the whole block into a shimmering mosaic. Clara didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Her mother reached down and took her hand, squeezing once lightly. Somewhere behind them, inside the building, conversations would continue about the meeting, about the girl who spoke flawless Japanese. Maybe people would look at her differently now. Maybe not. But here outside, under the quiet hum of street lamps, none of that mattered. Clara knew what she carried. She knew where she came from, and that was